Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good afternoon and good morning and good evening to those of you who are joining us online. A warm welcome to all to this side event to the Conference on Disarmament on Nuclear Risk Reduction at the Non-Proliferation Treaty. My name is Andrei Baklitsky. I'm a senior researcher at UNIDIR's WMD program, and I will be moderating today's event. While this is a standalone event, it's also part of the series of NPT-related meetings hosted by UNIDIR in collaboration with United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs and funded by the government of Switzerland that we are organizing in the lead-up to the 2026 NPT Review Conference. This series aims to enhance understanding of key issues and deepen engagement with NPT review process as we head towards the review conference, which starts in 2 months from now. Just to note that this event will be recorded and should be made available through UNIDIR YouTube channel in due course. Previous events we had were on the lessons learned from the previous review conferences, state of arms control, and AI nuclear nexus. Recordings of these seminars are already available on our website and on YouTube, so you are welcome to watch or rewatch them there. Today's event will focus on nuclear risk reduction and how it fits with 2026 NPT Review Conference. I don't think there is a need to explain why nuclear risk reduction is important. As UN Secretary General has recently said, humanity is on knife's edge with the risk of nuclear use at levels not seen since the Cold War. It's driven by eroding arms control arrangements, widening geopolitical rifts, and added complexity of emerging technologies like AI. These warnings have shaped the 2026 diplomatic agenda and underscore the urgency of concrete nuclear risk reduction steps. We will hear from our panel shortly with some questions to kick off the discussion, after which we'll be opening the floor to questions from those of you in the audience to our panel. For those in the room, please raise your nameplates or your hands, and I will try to make sure we will get to you. And for those online, please use the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. Your questions and comments will be treated as anonymous if you are posing them online, but if you want to be identified, please include your name in affiliation in the text box. For the first round of questions, I would ask the speakers to stick to the 5-minute limit. President-designate of the 2026 NPT Review Conference, Ambassador Viet, has stressed that he will strictly enforce the time limits, so we can use this panel as a training session. With this, let me turn to our first speaker, Ambassador David Riley. Ambassador Riley is UK Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the Conference on Disarmament. He had long and distinguished career in London and at the British Embassy in Washington, as well as the UK permanent missions in New York and Geneva. To start us off, Ambassador, the UK draft NPT report presented during this review cycle also covers nuclear risk reduction. Could you briefly describe what it proposes in this field, and if possible, what feedback you received during the discussions? And the floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you, Andrei, and good afternoon, colleagues. Particular personal thanks to the South African delegation for coming out in such strong numbers today. Before I answer your question, it would be remiss of me not to recognise that today is the 4th anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and I wanted to take this moment to commend and recognise the extraordinary courage and resilience that the Ukrainian people continue to show in the face of that invasion. But with that, I will come on to your question. So the UK's draft NPT report, which will soon to be our final NPT report when it's published in the next couple of weeks, has a number of areas in how it covers risk reduction. So firstly, the UK's core approach to nuclear risk reduction, that is essentially it is a responsibility of all nuclear weapon states to minimise misinterpretation, miscalculation, and ultimately the risk of nuclear conflict, but also to recognise that risk reduction is not a substitute for disarmament, but in our view, an essential step towards it. It sets out the UK's established record on risk reduction. So we've had no UK missiles targeted at any state since 1994. The former UK Defence Secretary Des Brown established the P5 process in 2009 to strengthen communication amongst the nuclear weapon states. We have a long-standing nuclear safety and security framework, and we have actually had historical bilateral risk reduction tools. So in 1967, direct communication link between the number 10 and the Kremlin. In 1977, a UK-USSR agreement on preventing accidental nuclear war. It covers the UK's current UK risk reduction proposals, which I think are probably best encapsulated in the 2022 P5 working paper for the review conference, building confidence and predictability through dialogue, increasing clarity, communication and mutual understanding, and strengthening crisis prevention and crisis management tools, all reinforced by maintaining high standards in nuclear weapon safety and security. It sets out the need for broader UK engagement beyond the P5, and the UK has a number of strategic dialogues, including with countries in this room, so for example South Africa, Brazil, Mexico and others, which we think are crucial for improving understanding of the UK's nuclear doctrine, for considering regional security drivers, and for thinking about mechanisms for reducing nuclear conflict risk. But also beyond those dialogues, we engage very energetically and actively with academics, with foreign militaries and with government experts to identify future risk reduction pathways. Within that context, it recognises the need to include non-nuclear weapon states, and I'd like to to recognise today that there is a lot of incredibly valuable work that is happening in preparation for the review conference, led by non-nuclear weapon states. Switzerland is one of them. I look forward to hearing from later on in the panel. But the non-nuclear weapon states they are integral to this global risk reduction process. And then lastly, I would say, just stepping back from some of that detail, the national report recognises the very difficult context within which all of this is happening. I suspect we might get into some of the detail of that later today, so I won't labour that point. But we're all very clear of the context in which we are operating, where there is heightened risk, where there is greater nuclear coercion, and where we are seeing an expansion of nuclear arsenals. And you asked what feedback we received during discussions of our national report. So we've held sessions in New York, in Vienna and in Geneva. I chaired the ones in New York and in Geneva. Many of the faces of colleagues in the room were at those consultations, so I'm only telling you what you told me. But for those online, to recognise that I think we had very positive feedback about the spirit in which the UK is engaging in transparency and the interactive reporting requirements under the NPT. We have, I think, had recognition of the work that we have done both on transparency and on risk reduction. We, of course, have heard very loudly, very clearly that risk reduction is not a replacement for nuclear disarmament, although I think there is a growing acceptance of the importance of risk reduction as a step towards nuclear disarmament and managing the very real risks that we see within the current context. And more broadly, I think it's fair to say that we have seen feedback requesting greater granularity and metrics around the nature of the UK's deterrent, greater clarity where we have offered ambiguity for reasons that we've explained in the sessions and which we can get into later, but largely for national security reasons and for the continuing credibility of our deterrent. And we've also seen, I think, feedback around how we might benchmark reporting across the reporting of the 5 nuclear weapon states so that we can actually have greater comparisons, both with the action plan from 2000 and 2010, but also across the 5 nuclear weapon states. And that's feedback has been really valuable for us and which we've reflected on as we have sought to finalise our report, which I said I hope will be published in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rayleigh. Thank you for sticking to the time limits and giving us a good example to go forward, and also for reminding us about the 2020 Common P5 statement, which I think is still valid and really important, and also stressing that we are living in a difficult global environment, and that's why the discussion of risk reduction is especially important. I'm delighted now to introduce Ambassador Xinjiang, who is Ambassador for Disarmament Affairs and Deputy Permanent Representative of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations Office in Geneva. And before coming to Geneva, Ambassador Chen was Deputy Director General at the Department of Arms Control at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador. China introduced a working paper in 2023 on nuclear risk reduction. And one of the points state there are no universally applicable measures to reduce nuclear risks due to the vast differences in the nuclear capabilities, nuclear policies, and the security environment of nuclear weapon states. If you nevertheless had to identify a small set of universal principles for risk reduction, what would they be? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm very glad to participate in today's event and to elaborate a little bit on China's positions on risk reduction. I think most of the colleagues have already read our working paper just mentioned, and also the white paper we circulated last year. And yesterday, in my statement in the high-level segment, I also referred to some of the elements and principles you asked about how to deal with risk reduction. You might notice that yesterday I also mentioned the 4 global initiatives, and many of the principles I think can be contained in this global initiatives, especially the Global Security Initiative. And I need to highlight several principles which I think is a little can be realistic. I have 4 in my mind. Number 1 is common security. I think this is a very important principle, and we always advocated for. To respect and safeguard each and every sovereign country's security and to seek solutions, political solutions through peaceful dialogue is key to reduce risks, including nuclear risks. And also it's very important to prevent such crises from happening. And we believe that each and every state's security is equal, and no country's security should be sacrificed for the sake of safeguarding one country's own security. So any idea of one country's security is superior to other countries' security will create problems for risk reduction. The second principle I would refer to is the rule of international law. And we believe it's very important to comprehensively, fully, and comply with the UN Charter and the purpose and principles and the international law and the international norms, including respecting sovereign equality as well as non-interference into other countries' internal affairs. We believe that Cold War mentality, unilateralism, and bloc confrontation, as well as rule of jungle, are in conflict with the purpose and principles of the UN Charter, and will create conflicts and risks. So it is very important to stick to the principle of international rule of law. A third principle I would emphasize is the need to safeguard global strategic stability. This is a term that constantly referred to recently, including by our US colleagues for global security, global strategic stability. We believe it's very important to safeguard global strategic stability. And There's a need to clarify what is global strategic stability. I might refer you to the joint statement published by China and Russia last year regarding safeguarding global strategic stability. We believe that it's very important to take into consideration both the strategic defensive and offensive capabilities in mind. And also, we believe any possible strengthening of military alliances and extended deterrences will also contribute to undermining the strategic stability and will introduce to arms race, which will raise the risks of nuclear conflicts. The fourth point, principle I would highlight is to prevention of crisis from happening. This is the Chinese way of dealing with addressing the root causes of such risks. We are concerned that on the one hand, people are saying that we need to prevent crisis from reduce risk. On the other hand, there are a tendency to escalate tension for political confrontation, and on the other hand, to seek guardrails to such risks. This is very dangerous. I referred to it yesterday in my statement. On this point, there are two aspects. One is to prevent a crisis from happening. This requires that every country respect the other country's core security interests. Like China, take China as an example. Taiwan issue is a core security interest. You might notice that we refer to the relations between China and Japan, China and the US constantly, because something happened regarding the Taiwan. This is a core interest of China, so it needs to be addressed. And second aspect, if something happened, we need to address the root causes of such crisis. And again, like the Taiwan issue, if something happened, then we also need to find solutions to respect the core interest of countries. This cannot be solved just through a hotline or such pre-notification of missile launch. And since they're already overtake the time, and I just want to conclude by saying that any risk reduction measures will not replace nuclear disarmament, but it will facilitate possible progress in nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Shen. And I think you gave us good top-level overview of how the global security can function, how nuclear weapon states want it to function. But now I think it leads neatly to our next speaker, who can speak about some more granularity and more details. I would now like to introduce Mr. Reto Wollenmann, Deputy Head of Section of Arms Control and Disarmament at the Swiss Foreign Ministry. And before that, Mr. Wollenmann held the position of Deputy Head of Task Force on Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and was posted to the Swiss mission to the Conference on Disarmament. So Reto, thanks for coming back again to Geneva after being here most of last week. So Switzerland has just hosted a meeting of the group of states on reducing the risk of nuclear conflict here in Geneva. Could you tell us more about the meeting and what the group is trying to achieve? The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Andre, and thanks for the great cooperation that we're enjoying, and also for organizing this side event. I will say more about the meeting we held here in Geneva last week in a moment. I just at the outset wanted to also clarify that it's not a formal group, but it's rather a loose grouping, a small but important distinction, and brings together a diverse and inclusive set of participants. On the one hand, it brings together 3 nuclear weapon states under the NPT, and in addition, a broad set of non-nuclear weapon states, including delegations associated with the Stockholm Initiative, the Nuclear Disarmament Proliferation Initiative, NPDI, the New Agenda Coalition, the NAC, and also the non-aligned movement. And thank you to Ambassador Riley for already mentioning the work done by non-nuclear weapon states over the past few years. I think really the level of knowledge and engagement from non-nuclear weapon states on that topic has increased. And I think now, as we're approaching the review conference, the non-nuclear weapon states are in a very good shape to be very constructive, very positive partners to all the nuclear weapon states to have informed discussions on these matters. So last week, in total, 24 states participated. We're quite happy with that turnout. Another particular characteristic is that this grouping not only brings together states, but also is supported by experts from a range of research institutes and think tanks. Some of the most knowledgeable and engaged colleagues from institutions such as UNIDIR, CPRI, Chatham House, Institute for Security and Technology, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies have been engaged. And you, the experts, have traditionally been part of those meetings and have provided valuable inputs to the discussions. And here in Geneva last week, we went one step further. And on the second day of the meetings, we invited additional experts. I think we had almost 20 experts from 12 research institutions, think tanks in the room. So effectively, this turned the gathering into a small 1.5 risk reduction summit. We're quite happy with that. And I want to acknowledge the excellent cooperation that we have with UNIDIR and IST, but also in particular with my friend and colleague Sahil Shah, who I hope is following us online today. The latest gathering that we had here in Geneva really helped us better understand the risk landscape and anticipate what contributions such a grouping can make in view of the review conference, including under different possible scenarios of the review conference. And I'm happy to elaborate a little bit more about that if I have a chance.
Thank you, Rita. Perfect. Now I would like to welcome Ambassador Alexander Kment, who is joining us online. And a technical announcement: you will need to put your headphones on to hear Ambassador Kment, and please do so while I'm introducing him. So Ambassador Kment is the permanent representative of Austria to the United Nations office in Geneva, and before that he served as a director of Disarmament, Arms Control, Non-Proliferation Department of the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Ambassador, Austria presented a working paper on nuclear risk reduction at the 2020 RevCon, followed by joint working papers in 23 and 24. At the same time, Austria has been clear about the need to accelerate nuclear disarmament. How do you balance those two priorities? Please, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, Ambassador.
Does it work now?
Yes, it does.
Okay, sorry about that. Good afternoon to all, and I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. Before I begin, I wanted to echo the comments made by Ambassador Riley of this grim anniversary of 4 years of the invasion of Ukraine. So it's very appropriate that we talk about nuclear risk reduction on a day like, on an anniversary like that, which has of course contributed to increasing nuclear risks dramatically in the past few years. So you asked about the working paper and how we balance the two priorities. First of all, I wanted to say that yes, of course, risk reduction is not a substitute for nuclear disarmament, and I actually never saw it that way. I understand the concerns of those countries who make the argument that this is just a sort of sideshow and takes away the attention of nuclear disarmament. But and you know, we have been putting a lot of emphasis on the impact of nuclear weapons. Any measure that reduces the risks of the use of nuclear weapons is important at the moment. So we do not see that there is a contradiction between maintaining the focus on nuclear disarmament, which of course is the gold standard when it comes to nuclear risk reduction, but focusing also on other measures that make the use or explosions, whether by intention or accidental, less likely. So we don't have a problem to balance the two priorities. At the time when the doomsday clock stands closest to midnight than ever in its history, we really need to make sure that this doesn't happen. I wanted to give a very brief history of this working paper, which comes out, the original version when we presented it it is based on discussions that took place in 2015 and 2016 in the open-ended working group on nuclear disarmament, which had wide participation from non-nuclear weapon states and essentially most nuclear umbrella countries. Of course, none of the nuclear weapon states participated in these discussions. Nevertheless, it had wide participation. And there were two aspects of the mandate. The first part of the mandate then led to the recommendation for negotiations on the TPNW, which of course became very contentious. But the second part of the mandate was to look at nuclear risks. And these discussions were very consensual. And essentially, the countries that participated in this open working group came up with a really comprehensive set of risk reduction measures, which, however, then was not, since the report was not adopted because of the contentious issues in part one of the mandate, even the risk reduction elements of part two of the mandate, which actually had the consensus of those states that participated, was also not put forward. So we wanted to harness that in the working paper and feed this into the NPT discussion, because it contains very, very useful recommendations from our point of view. The second thing I wanted to say is, and it brings me back to balancing the nuclear disarmament and risk reduction discussion. It's about the framing. I think that's the key issue. I think it's very clear that from the perspective of non-nuclear weapon states, the fact that they could be subject to the consequences of nuclear weapons, that is the risk to which they are exposed to, and on which they have very little say. So the perspective that I would say non-nuclear weapon states have when it comes to risk reduction is any measure that takes nuclear weapons as far away from any possible use as possible. Whereas the way I understand the risk reduction focus that nuclear weapon states put forward, more on a strategic risk reduction, is to essentially make nuclear deterrence less risky, which of course is important. I agree with that, but it leaves out those measures which would actually really remove nuclear weapons from use as much as possible, because they are not necessarily supported, because they could impact on what they perceive as the credibility of nuclear deterrence. So I think if we want to make progress in the risk reduction discussion in the NPT context, we should approach it from a broader risk reduction angle, which of course includes practical measures to make nuclear deterrence less risky, to look at the actual risks that are inherent in nuclear deterrence and also talk about those. And if we would frame the risk reduction discussion in such a broad way, I think we would alleviate this issue that risk reduction is seen by some as a substitute of nuclear disarmament, but actually have the much broader discussion about how we understand security and nuclear weapons, which I think we don't really have in the NPT, or certainly not in a way that takes into account the perspectives of non-nuclear weapon states. So I would be very much in favor of a discussion on risk reduction that looks at the concrete measures that are put forward by colleagues, but that also includes a broader look to really look at the underlying risks that are inherent in the possession of nuclear weapons and in the policies that are linked to nuclear deterrence. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. I think it's a great point that different countries see nuclear risk reduction as very different measures. And I think this sets up nicely for the last speaker, who is last in order, but by no means least, Cyrus Opatowski, who is an associate researcher at UNIDIR's WMD program, as well as Security and Technology program and Middle East Zone project. Cyrus is leading authority on nuclear risk reduction proposals submitted by states across different formats over the last decade. So let me ask you, there have been many risk reduction proposals in the current and also in the previous NPT review cycle. How would you even categorize them all, including some of those we have heard about today? Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Andre. Great to be here with our distinguished panel, such as you. Thanks also for the compliment of being a leading authority. Too kind. I hope not to disprove it. It's been a really interesting discussion thus far, and good to hear more about where priorities lie and how some states see reducing nuclear risks in this day and age. I also think the discussions thus far have illustrated that nuclear risk reduction has received increased interest by nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. This can be due to several factors that have already been discussed by the previous panelists, but it includes that risks are rising and states are eager to address this, and also that maybe more non-nuclear weapon states regard risk reduction as another venue to deliberate disarmament-related matters. Many of the most detailed risk reduction proposals have been introduced in working papers to the NPT. Indeed, China, United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Austria have all been active in producing working papers on what they think risk reduction should entail, as we've heard thus far. The current NPT review cycle has received triple the amount of working papers than that of the previous cycle. In addition, the states involved has been greatly diversified. Here at UNIDIR, we tried to create a framework for categorizing the proposals. We wanted to offer a means to better digest the wealth of risk reduction measures. This in turn is aimed to support mapping all proposals for allowing a better bandwidth for states to see what they would like to prioritize. For these purposes, we've identified 8 overarching categories, which I will now broadly go over. I should add that most, but not all, risk reduction proposals are aimed at nuclear weapon states to implement. One group of measures is under nuclear disarmament and arms control. This includes measures vis-à-vis strategic dialogue, arms control, and reductions in nuclear stockpiles and deployments. The second category concerns multilateral agreements and commitments. The NPT's cornerstone role is repeatedly noted, and some states have asked for risk reduction to be a regular ticket item to discuss under the NPT or CD. Other discussed agreements and commitments have included issues on nuclear testing, nuclear weapon-free zones, negative security assurances, and on fissile material. The third category concerns crisis prevention and management measures. These mostly serve to reduce the dangers of nuclear use through inadvertent escalation. Measures under this category include bilateral channels, hotlines, data exchanges, pre-notification of ballistic missile launches, as well as of major strategic exercises. The fourth category relates to transparency. Transparency is seen as a conducive measure to improve predictability, reduce the risk of nuclear weapons use, and as a means to showcase progress on disarmament obligations. This includes transparency between nuclear weapon states, between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, as well as for the public. The fifth category is on doctrinal and declaratory measures. Suggestions include reiterating the Reagan-Gorbachev statement that a nuclear war must never be fought. It also includes declarations of restraint, non-first use policy, and acknowledging the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use. The sixth category concerns operational measures. This covers measures like detargeting, de-alerting, dropping launch on warning postures, and maintaining human control over nuclear command and control systems. The next category we identified is on technological governance issues. Suggestions have varied between discussing and limiting certain weapons and capabilities, for example, on delivery systems, as well as on new and emerging technologies in the cyber, AI, and space domains. The final category relates to societal measures. There have been several proposals made on education and awareness raising, research and capacity building, as well as gender equality and inclusivity in risk reduction. I'll be happy to discuss these a little more later on, but for now I'll stop. Back to you.
Thank you, Cyrus, for this exhaustive list of all proposed nuclear risk reduction measures. We will do another round of questions, and then we will open the floor to the audience. If you have questions or comments, please do raise your nameplates, or if you are joining us online, submit them using the Q&A function, and we will take them once we are done with this round. With this, let me get back to Ambassador Riley. Ambassador, the UK is the current chair of the P5. Could you lift the veil a little bit and tell us about the P5 risk reduction agenda? Thank you.
A little bit, yes. I think we all recognise that the 5 nuclear weapon states have a particular responsibility in upholding the NPT, and the P5 process, which, as I said, the UK established in 2009, is a key channel for coordinating implementation of NPT commitments. I think the importance of that process is reflected in the fact that it has continued even through some incredibly difficult times over the past 4 years. Now, the breadth of that conversation has not been maintained, but the fact that we have come together regularly to discuss these issues frankly, and I think in challenging each other's, is important and is an essential part of trying to reduce the risk of nuclear conflict. The UK has convened 2 meetings under our chairmanship. The last one was in December, and we have sought to facilitate discussions actually that represent a degree of continuity from the Chinese presidency last year. So it's focused on nuclear doctrines, it's focused on strategic risk perceptions, and it's focused on practical steps to reduce risk. In the spirit of what Rita was saying, what I was saying earlier about the dialogue, we've also tried to support broader participation and new thinking. So we have strengthened the Young Professionals Network, for example, which brings together civil society and academic experts from across the P5 countries with the challenge of trying to generate new ideas and new initiatives and to cultivate the next generation of strategic thinkers on risk reduction. And I think that comes back to one of the points you made in your list around education as well. And then specifically on the NPT, we recognise this is not a conversation that's unique to the 5 nuclear weapon states, of course, and the UK is making every effort to explore what discussions or what can be discussed and what can be agreed, I think, in the P5 process in support of the NPT. Clearly the backdrop is difficult, and I hope you will understand why I perhaps won't get into details now, given that conversation remains live and very current, but certainly to reassure that the UK is working hard to see how we can discuss and agree something that we believe would be a helpful contribution to our shared goal, I hope, of a successful review conference in New York.
Thank you, Ambassador. I understand that some of those discussions you cannot share with us, so I appreciate you answering this question. And following this, a question for Ambassador Shen. Last November, China published its latest white paper, China's Arms Control, Disarmament and Non-Proliferation in New Era. And on nuclear risk reduction, it says, nuclear weapon states should effectively reduce the nuclear risk by reducing the role of nuclear weapons in their national and collective security policies. What would reducing the role of nuclear weapons will look like in practice, and how can we get there? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you again for mentioning our white paper. It's quite comprehensive. I would suggest the readers to digest. Some of the language is quite difficult to understand, but it is the most authoritative position of China regarding nuclear and other arms control related issues. In terms of practice of thinking, Sarah just mentioned a whole category of risk reduction measures. I think from our perspective, the reduction of the role of nuclear weapons is very important to facilitate actual reduction of the numbers of the nuclear weapons. And how can we achieve that? First of all, I think Sarah also mentioned the P5 published a joint statement in 2022. We can reaffirm our commitment that nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. This is a very short sentence, but very important. Each nuclear weapon states commit not to start nuclear war. So this is very important so that it will reduce the role of nuclear weapons. And secondly, in the joint statement, we also refer to the de-targeting. And I think David also mentioned that this is quite symbolic, but also an actual measure nuclear weapon states can take to de-target nuclear weapons against each other. And thirdly, China always say that no first use and negative security assurance. And some other nuclear weapon states probably will not be in a position at this stage to commit themselves to no first use. But we believe this is very important. The logic is like all nuclear weapon states commit not to use nuclear weapons against each other. That will be a fundamental change of the nuclear policy, and that will reduce the role of nuclear weapons in each nuclear weapon state's national security policy. And that means that we commit not to use nuclear weapons against other nuclear weapon states. And also, furthermore, commit not to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. That will reduce the role and the room for the use of nuclear weapons. That is generally reduce the role of nuclear weapons. And that will facilitate, because there is no utility for nuclear weapons, and that will create more favorable conditions for further nuclear reductions. And fourthly, we also think it is very important to abandon the nuclear sharing and extended deterrence nuclear policy, because that is that policy contains the use of nuclear weapons in certain scenarios. We believe that such kind of policy only increases the role of nuclear weapons rather than reduce the role of nuclear weapons. So these are the measures we have in mind how to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in national security policies as well as collective security policies. And I would like to also add one additional point. We talk about just now risk reduction, and also nuclear risk reductions. I think David also mentioned that there is also a difference between nuclear risk reduction and strategic risk reduction or strategic risk perceptions. I think there are some nuances in this regard. So I think nuclear risk reduction cannot be perceived in a siloed approach, but need to take into consideration various factors. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Perfect. And I'm really glad that timing is almost perfect in this session. So we're going to have a really good NPT review conference if we follow those steps. So following this, a question for Mr. Wallenman. The grouping on reducing the risk of nuclear conflict has spearheaded both a working paper and a joint statement in the NPT review process. What was the thinking behind those two documents?
Thank you, Andre. Yes. So at the last NPT PrepComs, the last two sessions of the NPT PrepCom, you will have seen that a grouping has submitted a working paper, and now we're working on an updated version for the review conference. Germany is taking the lead. We're putting forward really practical recommendations for the review conference, recommendations that can be supported by such a large and diverse grouping to which I referred to before. So yes, and you can also again expect an accompanying joint statement. By the way, there are also other states that are perhaps not part of the paper, but they can sign up to the joint statement to still support risk reduction as such. And we'll of course also have side events and other activities at the RevCon, really all aimed at raising the awareness for risk reduction and for advancing the group's proposals. So I believe the paper really contains that type of language that could serve as a useful basis for the discussions when we are getting towards the outcome of the NPT review conference, an outcome that should address nuclear and strategic risks. And we have, of course, also used this paper to talk to the Bureau, to the President-designate, to the UNODA WMD branch. We're in active conversation with all of them. And perhaps that brings me to talk about what the grouping is trying to achieve. In one sentence, it really, I think what unites us is that there is a shared objective of securing an outcome at the review conference that contributes to reducing the risk of nuclear conflict, as the name suggests. From a national perspective, perhaps not speaking on behalf of such a diverse group, from a Swiss perspective, why we're doing this. For us, it's really about making the case for risk reduction. What we want to contribute is want to contribute to strengthening the analytical and political foundations for why are we doing this, why are we putting this forward, evidence-based arguments on the urgency and on the relevance and of this agenda, because we believe that a stronger and a more solid case will help us build support across different groups of states and then to enable us to achieve concrete progress. Second, I think what this group very much is about, and why Switzerland is so engaged, is that we have an opportunity to move from conceptual or general debates to a practical discussion. We're consistently highlighting also in the paper things, very specific measures such as hotlines, crisis communication channels, risk reduction centers, pre-launch notification arrangements, many of the elements that Sarah Ruth has touched on in her contribution. And also I'm picking up on what Ambassador Kment said. For us, this is very much about advancing disarmament. We see a very clear link with the implementation of Article 6 and the 2010 NPT Action Plan. And you will see in the working paper language about reaffirming disarmament, the complete, verifiable, irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons, that is the only absolute guarantee against their use. There's good language about prevention of nuclear war, arms race, recognizing that risk reduction complements and does not replace nuclear disarmament. So for us, really, this is a very much this type of work very much is about reductions in arsenals can lower the risk of use, miscalculation, escalation, and at the same time, reducing risks then can contribute to a more stable environment that then can lead to deeper cuts. So to sum up, the working paper and the joint statement aim to build political momentum and to outline practical steps to reduce nuclear risks within the NPT framework. And with that, the group seeks to support actually a meaningful and a practical outcome at the review conference that then can help lowering nuclear risks. That's the overall goal, while reinforcing also progress on disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Perfect. Yes, and we all hope that whatever the number of countries in the group or supporting the statement, we hope that 191 member states will support the nuclear risk reduction in the NPT review conference, so we'll have it in the final document. So I will be returning to Ambassador Kment online, and again, another reminder, if you want to ask your questions, please raise your nameplates or send them in the Q&A function in WebEx. We already started receiving questions, but we'll be happy to have more. So the question to Ambassador Kment, the working paper that Austria sponsored addressed measures to reduce the risk of accidental, mistaken, unauthorized, or intentional nuclear weapons detonations, and those are issues that typically constitute the core of nuclear risk reduction agenda. However, they were not limited to these aspects. What else would you include in a broader risk reduction framework?
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Can you just confirm that the mic works?
Yes, we can hear you. It's working perfect.
Thank you so much. Yes, in answering this question, I wanted to come back to where I left before, the sort of different perception on what risk reduction entails. And I would say, again, from the perspective of non-nuclear weapon states, risk reduction should really be about measures that take nuclear weapons as far away from use. And this is motivated, of course, by the concern of the humanitarian consequences that would happen if something goes wrong. I think that's very clearly the perspective the vast majority of non-nuclear weapons, I believe, has. And that, of course, includes measures like de-alerting, de-targeting, taking weapons out of operational service. It includes no first use commitments and other doctrinal measures, among others, of course, with the nuclear disarmament and the actual elimination being the gold standard. But if you look at it from a strategic risk reduction perspective, which then the risk reduction focus, I understand, as being countering risk that could undermine the stability of nuclear deterrence relationships. And that, of course, is a different angle, because measures that restrict the ability to use nuclear weapons would then not be supported from that perspective, because they would be assessed as having a negative impact on the credibility of nuclear deterrence. So we actually have two quite different motivations behind. Of course, the joint motivation is to prevent nuclear weapons being used and the consequences, but the focus on what type of measures would then be different. So I think from that perspective, I understand nuclear weapon states' approach to risk reduction measures, that they would be considered only insofar as they do not impact the nuclear deterrence calculus, leaving aside, of course, the core issue that nuclear deterrence itself is the origin of all nuclear risks. I think this demonstrates an inherent contradiction in the discussion that I think we would need to tackle by a broad framing of the discussion. And this contradiction is the perceived necessity to maintain nuclear weapons in a manner that demonstrates the readiness and the resolve to always use them, as would be required for the credibility of nuclear deterrence on the one hand, and a more comprehensive approach to address this risk, which I think the non-nuclear weapon states would be looking for, which would be aimed to ensure that nuclear weapons will never be used, neither intentionally nor unintentionally through human or technical error. So how to tackle this in a way, I think it would be really good for the NPT to have a discussion that is as broad as that. I'm not sure that all nuclear weapon states would be ready to embark on this kind of discussion, but I think that would be necessary. And in addition to these points, the working paper that you referred to, of course, also includes a whole other range of measures. And I just want to highlight one section of the working paper, which is we really need to also talk about what actions would have to be avoided that would create an environment that is not conducive neither to nuclear disarmament, would actually increase the risk of nuclear conflicts. And this is, of course, the pursuit of new nuclear weapon systems, including their delivery system, that is implied and explicit threats of nuclear weapons use, that is provocative and escalatory actions or inflammatory and disparaging statements that increase the risk of nuclear conflict, intentionally or through error or through miscalculation. I think the reductions of transparency on nuclear arsenals should also be avoided, including delivery systems and doctrines. And of course, to avoid nuclear postures that assert the right to use nuclear weapons first, even in response to non-nuclear threats, among others. So I just come back to the point that I think we probably have a very broad support for a really meaningful discussion on risk reduction, if it is not limited, but if it is broad enough to include the perspectives that I think at least a large part of the non-nuclear weapon states would like to, the angles on risk reduction that a large part of the non-nuclear weapon states membership of the NPT would like to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And as I said, we will have to have all of those discussions at the NPT review conference, simply because it's a consensus-based decision-making process. So every state has its right to has its views listened to and then addressed. With this, the last question before we open the floor goes to Cyrus. And my question would be, you listed an impressive list of nuclear risk reduction proposals. So which among them are maybe less well known, but nonetheless have been proposed and deserve attention and deserve to be remembered?
Deserve to be remembered. Wow. Thanks, Andre, for the question. I do want to provide some context before actually answering your question. So overall, many of the proposals by nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states relate to crisis prevention and management, arms control, transparency, detargeting, and strategic dialogue. There's also quite a bit on the importance of declarations in support of reducing nuclear weapons in doctrines and demonstrating restraint. A lot of these have already been mentioned by the panel regarding the nuclear war must never be fought, detargeting. These are also things that appear at the 2022 NPT RevCon final documents draft. So it's good to hear those mentioned here as well. I also think it's important to recognize that even where a group of states sees the importance of advancing the same measure, only a portion of those states may label that measure as part of the risk reduction agenda. This, for example, stands out on the topic of reductions in nuclear stockpiles and deployments, on nuclear weapon-free zones, and on negative security assurances. So the fact that a certain measure receives less attention in risk reduction does not equate to it being less popular by states in other domains. So with that context, turning to the lesser-known risk reduction proposals, I'll try to give a few more specific examples, and I'll be doing this according to the framework I provided earlier. So for arms control and disarmament, this category contains some of the most discussed risk reduction measures. One perhaps lesser-known suggestion includes for nuclear weapon states to codify their current non-deployment arrangements for non-strategic nuclear warheads. Another is to firewall nuclear strategic dialogues from other issues characterizing states' relationships. Turning to multilateral agreements and commitments, one topic that generally in the past has received less attention is on nuclear weapon-free zones. Notably, in the 2024 PrepCon, we had a whole working paper dedicated on the topic of zones as a risk reduction measure. Interestingly, zones is one of the key topics that broadens the pool of states engaged in risk reduction discourse. There's also a similar story with negative security assurances. For some states, negative security assurances is the only issue they raise in risk reduction. Prohibition on testing is another example, and considering some of the more recent news, we might see more states making a direct link between prohibiting nuclear testing and risk reduction. On crisis prevention and management, one perhaps lesser-known proposal includes establishing a multilateral hotline system to be used during crises and notification of large-scale military exercises. In the category of transparency, we have proposals like increasing transparency through verification activities and declassifying historical information that would include any instances of close calls. The latter would be done in order to raise awareness of the breadth of risks associated with nuclear weapons. As for doctrinal and declaratory measures, in reducing the role of nuclear weapons in doctrines, we also have suggestions on diminishing the value attributed to nuclear weapons in military training and education. As part of the wider discussions around reducing nuclear risks, and this was mentioned briefly also by Ambassador Shen, Several states have stressed the importance of respecting each other's sovereignty, security, and development interests with a view to maintaining strategic stability and promoting cooperation and risk reduction. In operational measures, some lesser-known proposals have included demating nuclear warheads, ensuring the safety and security around nuclear weapons, and having joint training for nuclear weapons-related emergencies. In technological governance, some lesser-known proposals include for the P5 to further explore the impact of new types of delivery vehicles, as well as dual-capable long-range delivery systems. Another is to develop a multilateral regulatory framework for norms and legally binding instruments for new technologies. Finally, on the issue of societal issues, overall, the topic of education and awareness raising has received less attention. I know that Ambassador Riley is maybe opposite to that point, but it has generally received less attention. There have been a few non-nuclear weapon states that discussed different ongoing programs to better educate youth and individuals from all generations, but overall, this issue is more on the back seat. There has been more attention, albeit still limited in comparison to the other categories we've discussed, on research and capacity building as a means to reducing risks. That's it for me. I'll stop here. Back to you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's perfect. I think we have a lot to think about, a lot of measures already proposed. But with this, we have about half an hour for the Q&A. It's great to see that we already have some questions online. For those of you in the room, if you want to respond to something which you heard or you have any specific questions, please feel free to do so. And also for the panelists, if you want to react, to respond, to comment on some of the things which have been mentioned by other panelists, also feel free to do so. I will collect a couple of questions in this first round, and anybody in the panel, feel free to answer them. So the first one is pretty broad. There is a large amount of pessimistic discussion around expectations for the upcoming review conference. How much might this prior pessimistic attitude impact or shape proceedings on the ground? And is it important to change these expectations? And of course, if we don't have a final document, we will not have any language on nuclear risk reduction, but also no other language. So the question is how to manage these pessimistic expectations for the upcoming RevCon. Or maybe you don't believe there are pessimistic expectations. Maybe you believe we have optimistic expectations. The second question from the colleagues online is, how does the P5 risk reduction agenda translate political commitments into operational implementations? And how does the P5 assess the effectiveness of its mechanisms, particularly during periods of heightened tensions? I think those questions probably will be mainly to Ambassador Riley and Ambassador Shen. And then the last question in this round. Given the current geopolitical environment, which nuclear risk reduction measures would be impractical or counterproductive to advance at the upcoming NPT review conference? Are there such things as impractical or counterproductive nuclear risk reduction measures in the current environment? Do we have anybody who wants to jump in immediately? Reto, I see you, please.
I can certainly start, and then I'm really happy if others are jumping in. The first question on how ambitious, how optimistic, how much can probably the market bear also for the review conference, but in particular on risk reduction. I'm never the optimist, but I think that particularly because we are seeing right now increasing salience of nuclear weapons, Ambassador Kment has alluded to those more comprehensive risks, which are well understood, and particularly because we are also now having a review conference faced with unprecedented geopolitical tensions. I think it should be possible to generate forward movement. If not now, when should we be able to agree on something concrete to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons use, nuclear war? I think we are really And I'm quoting here also our colleague Sahil Shah from last week, saying that what we're really witnessing these days is a world in which we seem to lose order, but it's actually the emergence of a harsher, less forgiving form of a new world order, characterized by persistent competition, by a recurring crisis, by structural instability. And the central point here, I think, really has to be that risk reduction is the name of the game, is the call of the day. It's not futile in this context, but it's actually indispensable. So that gives me optimism. Perhaps also to the third question about what types of measures. It's been a fantastic menu of measures that Sarah Ruth has laid out. It's probably too much for a review conference for us, and I think in the Stockholm initiative at the last review conference cycle, we structured it in a much more simple way. And maybe that also helps delegates when they prepare for the review conference to think about risk reduction. It's not something overwhelming. We made three broad groups. One group is declaratory measures, the other one practical and operational measures, and the third ones are questions related to process. So declaratory measures include steps related to doctrine, signaling, political commitments, the Reagan-Gorbachev statement, for instance, things that really help reduce ambiguity, help lower tension. So this kind of broader set of declaratory measures. Then the second basket, so to say, would be practical measures. Really ideas to tools from the toolbox, basically, right? Communication channels, notification, transparency. If the RevCon can point to such practical measures as well, that would be fantastic. To that, I would, of course, also add transparency arrangements, confidence building steps, things that can directly reduce the risks of miscalculation or escalation. And the third basket, and perhaps also for diplomats as they prepare for the review conference, good to think about this, process-related measures, reporting, dialogue formats, review mechanisms. What do we do during the review cycle on this? So I think that helps us to discuss which measures can be realized, can be agreed upon at the review conference over time, then taken forward. But we need to kind of think clearly about the different categories. Thank you.
Right. We have still 2 months to go through all of those things. Anybody on the panel wants to jump in, maybe on the P5 aspect of it? I'm not putting anybody on the spot, but...
I mean, I'll just try to sort of canter through the three quickly, if I may. So my predecessor said to me when I first arrived here that optimism has to be part of a disarmament ambassador's DNA, because if we don't have optimism, what else do we have? And so I use a different P for the RevCon, which is pragmatism rather than pessimism. It's about recognizing that success has to be seen in the context of the world in which we are operating at the moment. And I personally remain hopeful that there is an outcome there for us to achieve that moves us forward incrementally and perhaps a smaller steps than some others would like to see towards our ultimate goal. And I think that flows into Reto's points around sort of what measures might be impractical, counterproductive. I think as a general principle, the more we try to get into detail in the context of an outcome document, the greater the risk of division and of failure. I like the idea that Alexander offered around creating space in which there is a debate around how one perceives risk reduction and the paradigm within which we view that. But we need to distinguish that from what we put into an outcome document. And the more I think we can try to focus on a set of agreed principles, rather than trying to, as Reto said, agree a sort of a prescriptive list of measures, the more likely we are to move forward politically, I think, towards those practical outcomes that Reto has advocated for. And then on the P5, I think it's really important to reinforce the point that this is a forum for dialogue. It is not a forum in which we seek to enforce agreements. Ultimately, it is a dialogue, and each country will then choose how to interpret and apply that dialogue within their own domestic procedures. And I think the idea that we might sort of begin to review and assess each other's respect for what we maybe perceived to be previous political agreements, the more we get into questions of verification, which I think perhaps are not necessarily the focus for P5 at the moment, where at the moment we're talking about, as I said earlier on, understanding doctrines, risk perception, practical measures towards risk reduction, and this year in particular, how we can support the NPT process.
Perfect, thank you. And I will give the floor to Ambassador comment online in a minute. But before that, in the room, Ambassador Shen, Cyrus, do you want to, maybe Ambassador Shen will start?
Thank you for the questions. I quite agree with. I was also writing to Chinese characters exactly what David just mentioned, pragmatism. And we also agree that we are facing challenges, and it will be a very difficult review conference. We would hope that we can have an outcome document, and if we, given the current geopolitical tensions, which I just experienced even in this workshop, we can feel that it will be very challenging in the review conference. But that does not preclude the possibility that we can agree on something that can be accepted by all. So that means that we need to go back to the basics. We need to reaffirm some of the general common ground that nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states and different groups can agree. So that's our approach to the outcome document. For example, we can highlight that we all attach, we respect the authority. We would commit ourselves to safeguard the authority of NPT. We will commit ourselves to all the obligations of the NPT. We will commit ourselves to the 3 pillars, and whether we can commit ourselves to the declaratory commitment that nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought, which appeared in the P5 statement. That will also be a very important element that can be included. About the P5 mechanism, also, we also attach very much importance to that mechanism. It's a very unique and necessary forum for the 5 to stick together to exchange views, and we have different views, definitely. And in our coordinatorship, it's very difficult, especially in the current time. But it is necessary for the dialogue to continue and try to identify some of the common areas that the nuclear weapon states can agree on that will also be useful for a successful review conference. And effective risk reduction measures, I listed several measures. I know it will be very challenging. I know it will be very difficult for China to persuade UK to commit itself to no first use policy at this stage, maybe in the future. And it will also be very difficult to convince China to be in terms of reporting, the standard reporting forms, and some of the concrete measures Sarah just mentioned, because we have different nuclear postures and different security environment. That's why it is very difficult. But at least when we can commit ourselves not to nuclear war should not be fought and cannot be won and should not be fought, and also commit ourselves to certain kind of commitment that can be agreed by all nuclear weapon states at this stage. But that involves the overall geopolitical situation and try to avoid too much politicization in the review conference. I know it will be very difficult to avoid some politicization, but too much politicization will definitely not be favorable to a substantive outcome from the review conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Chen. Sirs, do you want to take any of this? And I have to stress, you don't have to answer all of the questions, whatever you're interested in.
Yes, I think I'll let Ambassador Shen and Ambassador Riley to deal with the P5 question. So just very briefly on the pessimism, I think there's a difference between the pessimism on getting a final document in this review conference, as well as just pessimism on the utility of the NPT still. So even if we're maybe pragmatic about one, it's still important that we do have a common view about the NPT still being the cornerstone for nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. The bar might be lower, but there's an up day, there's a low day. Excuse me. And then as regards to impractical or counterproductive risk reduction measures to promote, as perhaps demonstrated by this panelist and also by the list that I gave earlier, states understand risk reduction to be different and they have different priorities. If some states are really interested in negative security assurances and see it as a risk reduction, it's not helpful to say this is an impractical measure to promote in the NPT. I will say that what is impractical, and we're also moving away from it, is just explaining why we still need to have nuclear risk reduction discussions, and that these don't take away from nuclear disarmament, and that discussion is already happening. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Cyrus. Very diplomatic. Ambassador Clement, if you want to jump in to answer.
Yeah, just very briefly to agree very much with the way Reto has the point that he's made. When, if not now, really. I mean, we all go into the REFCON with an understanding of the challenges. We are clear-eyed. I think there will be significant pragmatism and concern about not doing any damage to the treaty as such. But the urgency is such that we really have to not be despondent, but really go in with the ambition to achieve something. And bringing it back to the risk reduction point, I would say, of course, we are aiming for a final document. But if we do not get a final document and it may fall apart on all sorts of issues that may have nothing to do with risk reduction, if at least we will have had a meaningful engagement on those issues that is respectful and that addresses the different perspectives in a way that we very rarely, if at all, do in the NPT, then that will have been at least something to build upon. Of course, it's not ideal, but so I think it is extremely important for the future of the NPT that we find a way to engage on the fundamentally different perspectives that exist on some of the issues, rather than brushing over them. And if we find a way to do this on the risk reduction issue, that could be meaningful. Whether or not we will then be able to translate it into a final document is another question. Of course, we should try, but we should not be curtailed with defeatism before the conference even starts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this leads us to the last round of questions. I don't see any hands on nameplates in the room, so I'll just go to online questions. And really the one I think is quite interesting and maybe picking up on Reto and David's points that might be too much for the review conference. Did any of the panelists think some particular risk reduction measures or baskets are particularly suited for NPT and others could be suited for other fora, like maybe P5 or maybe even the Conference on Disarmament, notwithstanding challenges in the CD? So that's one question. And then one question from me to maybe also serve as kind of concluding remark. If you could include one nuclear risk reduction measure in the final document of 2026 NPT Review Conference, what would this measure be? And should we go in the same order as we went last time, being Reto being first?
Yes, happy to go first. So the first question, if I understood correctly, about among all the measures that we touched today, which ones are for the NPT, which are for the P5 process, which is that's a bit of an that's a little bit of an overload for me right now. But what my basic approach would be that we have to be very opportunistic. We have to not be like, okay, this is something only the P5 can talk about, or only we can talk in the NPT with 191 states. I think we have to be really pragmatic there as well and take things forward wherever there is a breakthrough possibility to take something forward. I often, in my system, say we have to ask the P5 to deliver more. I listened to what Ambassador Riley said. It's a discussion forum, but we keep asking the P5 to not just talk, but come with something concrete to the review conference. Now, is that something that points to the NPT, taking things forward in the NPT? Is that something that can be taken forward in the CD? Well, that would be wonderful. Or is it something that they could take forward in the P5 in the next cycle, working on better understandings on measures? I would be very happy to see anything. So the second question I think you asked about if we only had one thing coming out from the review conference. I think it would be the establishment of a regular and structured process among the P5, dedicated specifically to nuclear risk reduction. A process among the P5 that is really identifying, discussing, advancing concrete measures, just what I said before. But then combine that with a commitment to report back to the broader NPT membership through national reports, through structured discussions within the cycle. So tasking of the P5 to do concrete measure and bring it back to the NPT, because I think that would, on the one hand, help a certain continuity, accountability, transparency, and creating that space among the P5 to talk with a mandate and bring it back to the NPT, and building that practical bridge between the work undertaken among the nuclear weapon states and the legitimate interest from non-nuclear weapon states.
Thank you, Reto. And I think we can go in the same order. So, Ambassador Riley, please, the floor is yours.
I mean, I would just sort of foot stomp Reto's point around let's not limit ourselves at this stage or create sort of guide rails of which specific forum we need to be discussing things in. We need to discuss this as broadly as possible. And I'm conscious that we are in a session today is about preparing for the NPT, but I would go bigger than the NPT. I mean, if we limit it to the NPT, we are missing a couple of countries who are directly relevant to risk reduction. We risk marginalising the huge amount of expertise that Reto championed earlier on as part of your process you had in Geneva last week that sat next to me to my right as well. So, you know, let's not try to artificially constrain this in a way that actually limits our ability to generate ideas and build momentum. But it may be that at moments in the future, there are specific ideas that are born out of that dialogue where we need to negotiate them in the CD, or whether we need to sort of try to politically endorse them through other fora. But I think let's not constrain ourselves at this stage. I mean, there have been, Reto, in the past, practical ideas that have come out of the P5. You know, I don't want to sort of, I don't want to celebrate too loudly the famous glossary, you know, but there are things that actually we have agreed in the P5 in the past. So there is potential to do so again, but the context is very difficult at the moment. And then what one thing would I put in there? Why not have something that captures the P3 commitment to human in the loop and ultimate political control of the use of nuclear weapons?
Perfect. Thank you. Ambassador Shen.
Thank you. Regarding the forum, for me, I think it's the talking points I have in all these forums are quite similar. Either the P5, CD, MPT, First Committee, or UNDC. And NPT is almost universal. So I think quite similar approaches and initiatives can be put forward. Of course, we need to dress carefully in the framework of the CD regarding the universality issue of the NPT. There's some kind of sensitivity on this issue. What kind of measures we would prefer to be reflected in the final document? Easy for me to say, no first use, but I know it will be quite challenging. Ideally speaking, or not practically speaking, I think at least elements of the P5 statement can be referred to in the outcome document, or at least the statement can be referred to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shen. Cyrus?
Yeah, so very briefly, on the first question, I'd like the point about being opportunistic and not guardrailing what we have. I also think it is important to recognize that each of these forums have different memberships. So engaging with the nuclear armed states that are not part of the P5, that's what the CD offers. Maybe not to the same detail as the P5 process, but it's still something to recognize. Perhaps something that the P5 can do in the process itself is just talk a bit more about the detail and a bit more about reciprocal measures. But again, the role of the non-nuclear weapon states in both the CD and NPT and other groupings is very important. As for what measures to include in the NPT final document, I struggled with this question quite a lot. I have the list of full measures. Whether any of them get in is another question. But looking at also just kind of discussing what might be important to refer to if we're talking about referring to the P3 working paper about human in the loop or about the P5 statement, I think it is important to remind people what has remained intact or keeping also what has been in the draft final document from 2022. So things like data exchanges are topics that only came up in nuclear risk reduction. So I think that is important to keep.
Thank you, Cyrus. And now we have Ambassador comment online.
Thanks a lot. Much has been said. I fully acknowledge that some practical risk reduction measures will have to be discussed among the nuclear weapon states. But I'm very much in favor of the commitments about taking these actions being taken in the NPT, because I want to see this linked to the implementation of Article 6 and as part of the treaty obligations also vis-a-vis the non-nuclear weapon states that nuclear weapon states have taken on. So I understand. I mean, I fully agree. Of course, we need to see progress wherever it can made, but I like to link it to the implementation of Article 6. Also, coming back to what we said very early, is it a substitute for nuclear disarmament? Yes or no? I would say it must be an integral part of the implementation of Article 6. And as to the measure, the risk, the one concrete risk reduction measure, I'm actually going to cheat and say two. First of all, I agree with the one from David. I think this is probably a hugely urgent aspect to ensure human control about NC3. But in terms of the wish list that I would have, it would be the creation of a sustained conversation about how do we actually really move away from a security paradigm that is based on the threat of mass destruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think this concludes our discussion for today. It only remains me to thank our panelists and speakers for joining us. Ambassador Rayleigh, Ambassador Shen, Mr. Wallenman, Ambassador Kment, Ms. Opatowski. Thank you all for joining us today in person and online. It's high-level week. Everybody's busy. Everybody's foreign ministers and directors are here, and you have to run to do a lot of different meetings. So thank you for taking your time and being with us. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Cyrus, James, Louisa, Victor, and Vary for helping make things work, and UNODA colleagues for their input for this event. This event and the series are being funded through support from Government of Switzerland. So thank you again to Switzerland for their support. The next events in the series will focus on transparency and accountability in NPT process and peaceful use of nuclear energy. So keep an eye for them on our social media account. They'll be registration link. Before closing, I would also encourage you all to complete our feedback form. There are some forms offline. There'll be a QR code on the screen now for doing this online. If we can take one takeaway from this session, if I would make one takeaway from this session, it's Reto's, if not now, when. I think we are in a quite difficult time, so we need to make some strong efforts with this. Good afternoon, good day or night, depending on where you find yourself online. Thank you.